DHCP is Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and what does DHCP do? The task of DHCP is very simple, and I think this is one of the most easiest servers to understand and even configure in a Windows environment. Now, DHCP is related to IP address. Now, you know that every computer in the network, every computer on the network needs an IP address. We understand that part. Let's say if you have 1,000 computers or 2,000 computers or whatever, and you want to assign IP addresses to each one of them. One is, okay, fine, for all the 1,000 computers, I will assign a static or a manual IP address, meaning I will manually assign them an IP address. So I go to each and every computer and open the IP address settings like this. And I go run ncpa.cpl, and let me check. This is the network card of the client. And if I click on properties, and if I click on TCP IP version 4, click on properties, and if you notice, I have assigned an IP address to this machine. Right? So I had to manually feed in this IP address. So for all the 1,000 computers, if I'm going to manually feed in the IP address, it's going to take me a lot of time, number one. And second, I would tend to make mistakes. It might happen two computers get the same IP address. What does DHCP do? DHCP does a very simple thing, right? DHCP says you don't need to go to each and every computer and assign an address manually. DHCP says I will take care of the function of assigning an IP address. So DHCP says what you got to do is you got to give a range to the DHCP server. You got to say, let's say I'm going to give 192.168.0.1 to, let's say 192.168.0. Let's say 50. So you can give a range to the DHCP server that whenever a client comes and asks for an IP address, right, the DHCP server can give an IP address from this pool. So what you need to do is you need to generate a pool, and you need to assign the pool. You need to assign the pool to the DHCP server so that the DHCP knows that, you know, from where to give an IP address. So when the client comes in, the DHCP is going to look in its pool. Okay, my admin has given the pool of 1 to 50. So let me see the first available IP address and give it to that client. So what does DHCP do? It automates the assignment of IP address. That's it. Simple. Not only that, if you must have noticed on my computer out here, right? You give the IP address, you give the subnet mask, you also give the DNS server IP, right? And you are wondering why the default gateway is not there. Let me put on the default gateway pertains to the router. If you have a router, let's assume that I have this router in my organization. The DHCP is supposed to give all of this also. Not only the DHCP server will give the IP address to the client, it will give the default gateway address, it will give the DNS server address. It will give all of this information to the client. So we can configure the DHCP to give all this information to the client so that the client, you don't need to manually go and, you know, assign an IP address to all the computers in the infrastructure.
So again, Michael, in a nutshell, if you say, like we said, DHCP also has to do with IPs, and DNS again, like it's a repository of all IPs. So what
No. DNS will maintain a database of names and IP address.
Okay.
So given a name, you want to convert it to an IP address. That is what DNS will look after, right? So what does DNS do? What does DNS do? DNS contains a mapping of name to IP addresses. Okay. DHCP assigned an IP address. Assigns an IP address. Okay. So let's configure. Let's see how this configuration is done of DHCP. So what we have here, this is my client machine which we are going to use for testing. And here is my domain controller, my DC. I'm not going to do anything on the DC, but I'm going to work on server 1. Server 1 is what I want to make as my DHCP server. So let me just log into this. And as usual, we will go to Server Manager and add roles and features. I will click on next to this. Next server has a pending restart. We recommend you restart whatever. Let me see if I can go ahead without the restart. So I will click on this option, DHCP.
Okay.
Add features.
So now we are sort of creating the DHCP server and defining the rules.
We are installing the DHCP server components. So that this server becomes a DHCP server. Always remember, whenever you're configuring any role or something like that, you need to look at this flag, which will give you a notification and tell you if there is some additional configuration required. right?
Yep.
So you can click on this option which says complete DHCP configuration, because it will do certain steps now. So if you notice, some groups are going to be created, and also an authorization of the DHCP server is going to be done. Authorization means it's like what if someone gets a laptop into your office, and if they configure a DHCP server on their laptop, right? So maybe your clients will take an IP address from that laptop. It might happen like that. So, Windows clients are configured to listen to only authorized DHCP servers. So what I'm doing now is, since I'm the domain administrator, and when I click on next, I'm authorizing this DHCP server with my credentials. Can you see my credentials over here? I'm the domain administrator. So I'm authorizing this DHCP server to work. And then what it means is that if there is someone else in my organization who puts up, their own DHCP server, the clients will not listen to them. The clients will only listen to the authorized DHCP server, which is this one. So I'm clicking on commit. So the authorization is done. I'm authorizing this DHCP server to start operations, and done. Okay. And now what I need to do is, and now I need to do the configuration. So I click on tools, and I click on, and now I need to do the configuration of the DHCP server. So to do the configuration of the DHCP server, what I need to do is, I need to double click on it, and I will see two things. One is IPv4. One of the first things that we need to do is we need to configure a scope, right? So in order to configure a scope or a range, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click IPv4. I'm going to click on new scope, and I'm going to click on next to this. And I'm going to give a name to the scope. Let's call it something like first floor. Sometimes you will have department name, sometimes you'll have first floor, second floor, whatever. So, or sometimes you'll have prod and you'll have development network, something like that. So I'll just give a random name out here. Click on next. And here it says, what range do you want the DHCP server to give IP addresses out of? So let's give the start IP address, right? And 192.168.0. And let's say I want, right now I'm deciding randomly, but in a real in environment, it is not done randomly. Okay. So let's say I want to start with 50 and I want to end with 192.168.0. And let's say I want to end with 50 to 60. So that means my first machine will get an IP address of 50. I'm assuming so, and likewise. Okay, so I click on next, right? And now it asks me for exclusions. Do you want any exclusion? Now, what is the meaning of exclusion? Right, let me explain that to you.
Range. Sorry.
Yeah, meaning it could be something like this. Let's say let's say the range that we have given. What is the range that we have given? We have given 50
to 60.
Right. Now, let's say address number 55, right? You have to assign it manually, or you have already assigned it manually to some server. So there's some server who cannot take an IP address from the DHCP. You have to give a fixed address to this server. And so you have manually assigned this IP address, 192.168.0.55. You have assigned it, right? Now you do not want the DHCP server to give this IP address to anyone else, because if the DHCP server, because this IP address falls in the pool, so if the DHCP server gives this IP address to anyone else, right, now that could be a conflict between the two, and one of the machines will not work, right? So I can give an address that I believe I've already assigned to somebody else. So let me put that address over here, 192.168.0.55, and I will end with 192.168.0.55 because it's just one IP address. That's it. So the DHCP will not give this IP address. Let me click on next onto this, and let's see. It means, IP addresses are normally given out on lease, right? Lease meaning, now if you notice there's a lease duration of 8 days, right? The meaning of that is, every 8 days, not every 8 days, when 50% of the lease duration expires, so let's say, 4 days expires, the moment 4 days expires, right? The client is supposed to renew the IP address, supposed to go to the DHCP server and ask for the IP address again from the DHCP. So now, what if the client is off the network for a long period of time? And if the client does not come to the DHCP server to renew the lease, then the DHCP server can give the IP address to someone else. You understand the concept. This is taking an apartment on lease. When you take an apartment on lease, you take it for 11 months, and then every 11 months you got to renew the lease. If you don't renew the lease, what's going to happen? The owner of the apartment will give the apartment to somebody else, isn't it? That's something that you need to know. So then you'll understand. So whenever you connect to the DHCP and there's a client, the client has to go through a specific process in order to get an IP address from the DHCP. And that process is known as DORA. It is called discover, offer, request, acknowledge. The meaning of that is initially the client is blank. It doesn't know who the DHCP is, where it is. It doesn't know anything. What it does is it sends a broadcast. It sends a DHCP discover broadcast. Okay, meaning it sends a broadcast packet that goes to every computer on the network. Everyone receives it, and then in that discovery, it contacts the DHCP server and it tries to find out who's the DHCP server. And the packet, the broadcast packet, goes to the DHCP server also, and the DHCP server replies. It replies to the client saying that, okay, what do you want? You want an IP address? Fine. Let me look into my pool and let me look into which IP address is available and let me give you an offer. So the DHCP server offers an IP address to the client. And then what does the client do? The client requests that IP address from the DHCP. Right? The client requests the same IP address. Yes, I'm happy with that IP address. I request the same. And finally, the DHCP server sends an acknowledgement to complete the process. This is known as a DHCP DORA process. What we have, okay, so what you see here is we are still configuring the DHCP server, and it says, do you want to configure DHCP options for the scope now? Meaning there are more additional options that need to be configured, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on next to that. I want to configure them. So one of the first things it asks, do you have a router or a default gateway? As I'd mentioned to you, the DHCP server not only will give the IP address, but it will also give the default gateway or the router IP address if you have any. So I'll click on add. And then I will click on next. So I do have a router address, and I will click on next to that. And then the next thing it says, so do you have a domain? Meaning, do you have a DNS? Yes, I do have a DNS. And the name of my, so make sure that this information is correct. Server name is DC, and the IP address is one. So what the DHCP server is going to do, it's also going to give this information to the client as to who is the DNS server. So the DNS server is 192.168.0.1. So I will click on next to this completely. The Win server is not used anymore. Don't even try to find out what it is. Okay, so we click on next. And do you want to activate the scope now? It says, I will say yes, I want to activate the scope now. Click on next and click on finish. Done. And so now what is, you will see the scope. You will see the address pool that you've defined. We have defined from 50 to 60.
Yep.
We have defined an exclusion of 55. So this IP address will not be given to anybody. Address leases. I can see if the moment the client gets an IP address, I will see it over here. So let's do that. So I will go to the client, right? Now my client is, I'll just log into the client. At this moment, my client machine has this IP address, which I had assigned manually. Now, if I want my client to obtain an IP address from the DHCP, I have to do a very simple thing, obtain an IP address automatically. And then I have to say obtain DNS server address automatically. So you're just telling the client, go and find out where the DHCP server is and get an IP address from the DHCP. So you understand now the client is going to go through the DORA process now in the backend. It's going to do discover. Then the DHCP server is going to do offer and request and acknowledge. And this process is going to complete, hopefully, and we should get an IP address. And that's a very fast process. It doesn't take time. And if I want to know what IP address my server has got, I click on details, just hold on. Whenever you're troubleshooting DHCP, right, and your client is not getting an IP address from the DHCP server, what you can do is you can do IPconfig /release. This is actually a troubleshooting command. So release the current IP address, whatever you have, because I don't know what it is from where you got it. Maybe you got it from the wrong place, and you do a renew. And then you do an IPconfig /renew. So release will release the current IP address, whatever it has, and renew will get the IP address again. And if you notice, we have got this IP address from the DHCP. We've got 192.168.0.50, which I believe is the first IP address in the range, isn't it? We defined a range of 50 to 60, isn't it? And we got a default gateway address. And what I will do is I will do an IPconfig /all so that I can get all the details. So I can see the IP address I've got. I can see the default gateway address, and I also can see the DNS server address. Can you see this? This is, we have mentioned the DNS server address, right? 192.168.0.1. And if I click on over here, and if I right click and I refresh this, And I can see that my client has got an IP address of 50.